Thank you very much. Asylum seeking of Afghans entering Iran and Pakistan has a very long history. In April 1978, and after the overthrow of Mohammad Dawood government by Marxist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Afghans began fleeing from their homeland. In 1979, the rate of refugees leaving their country accelerated.
Can you please bring closer your microphone?
Sorry?
Bring closer your microphone.
Oh, okay. 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 In 1979, the rate of refugees leaving their country accelerated after the invasion of Soviet Union to Afghanistan. The refugees who came to Iran at this time were welcomed by Iran, and they were granted Iranian citizenship. They were the most luckiest refugees, Afghan refugees that entered Iran. In 1998, when Taliban gained the control, many educated people fled Taliban regime. The final wave of refugees, numbering 200,000 to 300,000, left Afghanistan during the US-led invasion in October 2001. It has been more than 30 years since Afghan people entered Iran as migrant workers and refugees and stayed there permanently. Based on UNHCR official website report, around 920,000 Afghan refugees are living in Iran. Also, based on a report that is presented in the Parliament of Iran in 2016, 450,000 Afghans are in the country as migrant workers. They were the refugees who were not granted with refugee status. So the government tried to find a solution and decided to give them a visa to legitimate their presence in the country as migrant workers. It is estimated around 1 million Afghans are also residing in Iran as illegal and undocumented migrant workers. Their situation is really worse. They have no identity, they are no one. And if they are arrested by the government, they would be deported as soon as possible. So these are the ones that hide themselves, also the most vulnerable to addiction and crime. In Iran, refugees are not granted unlimited residency status. They were issued with temporary registration called Amayesh. This card has to be renewed annually, and the refugees have to pay a lot of money for getting this card. So sometimes it is asked that each person pay around $100 for their cards to be renewed. And many of them cannot pay this money, therefore they lose their status as refugees and become undocumented person in the country. This card does not provide them with citizenship or permanent residency and just entitle them to basic health and education services provided by Iranian government. By this card, people can only register their children to school and go to hospitals for receiving very basic medication. Otherwise, having this card is not a privilege for them. Afghans without these cards are subject to deportation. Iran is a signatory of 1951 Convention and 1967 Protocol of Refugees' Rights, signed in July 1976, and is trying to fulfill the commitments as best as it can. But the challenge is that these rights are meeting just the basic needs of refugees and are designed for the short time period of living under the refugees status, while the refugees in Iran are living in the country for around 30 years, and still they are not Iranian citizens. Hyperinflation in the country has affected the delivery of services by different government sectors to Afghan refugees. There has also been a dramatic rise in the cost of living, including food items, other basic needs, health, and education-related costs. This has affected Iranian, but the refugees population in particular. UNHCR estimates around 24% of registered refugees are considered vulnerable. Estimation shows that more refugees will step in this vulnerability position soon as life is becoming more and more difficult and expensive in Iran. And this increases the possibility of drug consumption as well, the vulnerability. The crisis of refugees in Iran is not a simple issue which could be solved easily because it has got different aspects. From one perspective, Iran has a very weak economy and is unable to support its own people adequately. There is a high rate of inflation and unemployment in Iran, which has hit majority of Iranians badly. but let's see how it contributes to addictions of refugees. It is very interesting that there is no single statistics about the number of addicted Afghans in Iran. Neither UNODC nor Iranian government, and not even UNHCR is interested to find out what percentage of Afghans are addicted to different drugs. And there is no official reports that is announced in this regard. But some local reports estimates that there are 2 to 4 million addicts in Iran, and probably the prevalence rate among should be the same in comparing Iranian and Afghans. That the prevalence rate should be the same. The effect of civil war in Afghanistan and the challenges of being a refugee in another country that you are not welcome in have especially affected refugees. Refugees usually live in poor, hostile, crime-ridden, and violent environment with few or no service available. Therefore, the children and youth of these families are raised and are inclined into a world of drug, prostitution, crime, despair, and even suicide. Personal, social, and economic problems make most of refugees suffer from severe mental, emotional, and financial problems, which are considered as a risk factor. Apart from poor job prospects and lower status in society, the lack of education and training often make refugees vulnerable to physical and emotional mistreatment. There is also a great discrimination against women in Afghan community due to gender inequality, which has trapped women and girls in poverty for generations. In Afghan communities, mothers and girls are the most vulnerable to depression, anxiety, malnutrition, sickness, as very few resources are allocated to them due to cultural discrimination against women and their dependency to men, which makes them a good candidate for becoming an addict. Some of the reasons of addiction among refugees are vulnerable living in area. Afghans are living in a very crime-ridden and poor area where the kitchens, some factories that produce drugs are placed there. And therefore, drug is very accessible to them and very cheap. And even they can contribute to making drugs by themselves. This has made them really vulnerable about using drugs. Psychological problems is another reason that makes refugees vulnerable. We have some clients, a client, she has seen that her father, brothers, and uncles were beheaded by Taliban people during under the Taliban regime. So the refugees who come to Iran, they generally have serious trauma, and trauma is one factor that can lead them toward consumption of drug. No or little life skill is another reason that makes them inclined to drug consumptions. Refugees have, in past 30 years have been moving, and they always were living in uncertainty. Therefore, the parents didn't have the chance to teach them life skills to their children, and maybe they did not even have that themselves. So unfortunately, the research we did in our project, we found out that they are not equipped with life skills at all. Unemployment among refugees is another problem. Afghan refugees can only work in 4 fields in Iran. It is agriculture, mining industry, construction work, and handicraft. These are the jobs that Iranians do not like to have. And therefore, these jobs are given to Afghan refugees, but they cannot work in other fields. It means that they can never improve in their job or do the job that they like. But on the other hand, this market is already saturated. Therefore, there is a high competition finding a job in these 4 fields as well. Economic and social discrimination is another factor. Refugees are always seen as second-class citizens in Iran. And when we talk about Afghan refugees, everybody considers them as criminals. Nobody wants to sit next to refugees, or they see them as a potential risk, and they try to avoid them. And Afghan refugees are also filled with hatred, and they suppress their angers. But this anger can also be a reason for making them vulnerable to addiction. Ethnic disclosure is another problem. Afghans are suffering, especially the youth, from identity crisis. They do not know whether they are Iranians or they are Afghans. They are born in Iran, but within an Afghan family, and they have acquired Iranian culture, and also they were under influence of their parents. So they are not sure who they are, Iranians or Afghans, and what their culture. They do not want to follow the culture of their parents, but at the same time, they are not Iranian 100%. So there is this confusion that has led to identity crisis among them. The other reason that Afghans use drug is medical reason. Health is very expensive. Health services are very expensive in Iran, even for Iranians. And Afghans cannot afford going to hospitals. Therefore, most of them use opiums as a treatment to their sicknesses. Although it does not treat, at least it kills pain, and they do not need to just go to a hospital and treat their problem. And they take opium, and after a while, they become an addict. And having illiterate parents is also very important. The illiteracy rate is very high among Afghan refugees. Therefore, the illiterate parents do not respond to their children's psychological needs, do not accept changes in their children's worldview and attitude, and they use illogical ways to treat their children. But the good news is that there are some protective factors at work as well. One is religious belief. In Islam, smoking is not illegal and is not a sin. So, for Sunni people, there are some clergy leaders who believe that smoking drug is considered as sin. And Afghans are really religious, and they observe Islamic law strictly. And therefore, this can play a role, protective factor that hinders them from smoking drugs. The other factor is that strong networks, family networks. Although Afghans are suffering from identity crisis, and although the parents are illiterate, but still the network is very strong among them. And these social networks leaves individuals and families within noticeable traditional family support. We cannot talk about addiction among refugees if we do not talk about addiction in Iran, because they are in Iranian context, and whatever happens to Iranians applies to Afghan refugees as well. Iran is in transition line for drugs that are imported illegally and criminally from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and exported in the same way to Turkey and Europe. So it makes our country very vulnerable to drug abuse. But the sad news is that, we have used opium for centuries, and this has become part of our culture. Still, in some small cities, when a girl wants to get married, the girl's parents have to give the instruments that is needed for drug consumption as a dowry to their daughters, to the bride. It might be funny to say that my grandfather was a merchant, and his wealth was counted or measured by the number of opium roll he had in his storage house. So in Iran, smoking opium is not a taboo, and it has been very prevalent for many years in our country, and even centuries. Although opium use has been reported in Iran since centuries ago, but it has currently changed to a problematic issue with widespread psychological, familial, and economic difficulties. There is no clear report about the prevalence of drug abusers in Iran. There is one report which estimates that there are 2 to 4 million substance abusers, but these reports belong to 15 years ago, and the government is not renewing or giving the new statistic. So this statistic is not an accurate one. It's very old. In addition, the current formal announced number of drug users in Iran is about 2 million, that 1,200,000 of them are drug dependents, and 800,000 are recreational abusers. According to the national authorities, there are over 1,032,325,000 opiate dependents in the country, which makes 2.26% of the adult population. This places Iran among the countries with highest prevalence of opioid use worldwide. Right now, we have faced with another problem. The use of crystallized heroin is increasing as opposed to the traditional, less disadvantageous use of opium. Amphetamines type stimulants and methamphetamines, notably known as shisha or crystal, has become really popular in the market. It is very cheap. It can be made inside the country, Iran, and it's quite available. And this has risen to become, this has made Iran to become the second country in crystal consumption. The problem is that in the past, it was generally men who were smoking drugs, but now women and youth are also, who were the minority groups, are also taking drugs, and the addiction problem has become very serious among them. The other problem that we are facing is the transmission of HIV and AIDS among Iranians. The statistic says that there are 71,000 HIV positive people. This statistic should be multiplied by probably by 3 because they are the ones that are already tested for their HIV status. And there should be many who are still unaware of their HIV status. And 68% of these numbers are the ones who acquired HIV through unsafe drug injecting practices. And the other problem is we have in regard of imprisonment. Half of the people who are in prisons are arrested and accused due to drug-related crimes. And half of them have also were under the influence of drug when they were arrested. But the good news is that in last 15 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has established many programs for addressing the problem of drugs and HIV in various areas of treatment on a large scale in communities and prisons. Many communities now benefit from outreach programs, drop-in centers, and other initiatives. And the NGOs are generally involved in implementing the programs. Iran also is very famous for distributing condoms and needles in prison and started these initiatives as well. And now it is practiced in some of the prisons as well. But the problem is that although these services are available, Afghan refugees cannot be benefited from these services. It's not because the infrastructure is not there. It is because first they should have a Mayesh card or the to be known as refugees to have access to these services. But the ones who do not have Al-Mayesh card are the most vulnerable, who cannot go to different centers and ask for help. So it means that the addicted ones are on the streets with no help and no support. Because if they go to these centers, they will be arrested by the police and deported from the country. The other problem is financial barriers. Even for Iranians, treatment is not for free. It was supposed to be for free, but now the government policy has changed. And it means that they have to pay a lot of money for treatment. They do not have this money, so this means that there is no treatment there for them there. And there is no subsidies as well. But let's talk about our project among Afghan refugees. Operation Mercy is a Swedish relief and development organization working in Central Asia and Middle East and North Africa by serving poor and marginalized people through community development and human aid projects. In 2009, government of Iran came and asked us to help Afghan refugees, especially in addiction field. First, we decided to help women, addicted women, and we find out that Afghan women who are addicted to drugs are generally involved in prostitutions as well. They were not interested to come to our centers and be benefited from our services because based on Islamic law, if they are arrested as prostitutes and if they are married, they would be stoned to death. And they are frightened to come and ask for help. For them, it's easier to be a prostitute than ending up in prison and spending many years of their life behind the bars. So then we decided to work on addiction prevention field. So in 2002, we respond to the needs of refugees and try to empower them and having addiction prevention programs among Afghan youth. Operation Mercy's methodology for drug prevention among Afghans youth were increasing awareness, equipping youth with life skills, providing counseling sessions, and enhancing life quality. In 2009, we started addressing the system, process, and institutions that perpetuate poverty and consequently addiction among Afghan refugees. What we did was we started working with refugees by teaching life skills to them. To hook them, we provided trainings in football, volleyball, and English trainings because they were the trainings that Afghans were mostly interested in. And our research showed that Afghan youth were not equipped with life skills that are needed for living as refugees in a foreigner country, especially in Iran, where everybody is prone to addiction. So we started providing our services and established the first and only social service departments for refugees. Even up to now that I'm talking to you, there is no other center that providing psychological services to Afghan refugees. So through football and volleyball training, a space was created for dialogue. So we could teach group work, tolerance, anger management, and some other life skills. We also helped them in critical thinking, to gain the skills of critical thinking. We try to increase their confidence and create the sense of solidarity and among them, and also create hope and create hope. So after 1 year, we evaluate our project, and we found out that although we provided good services, but the expected result was not met. And we found out it is because the mothers, who are the backbones of the families, were not in line with our program. The mothers were not happy that their children are part of our project because the children have to go and work and generate income. And for them, having their children in our centers means that there would not be enough bread on the table at the end of the day. So most of them resisted their children spending their time in our center.
Could I please ask you to conclude?
Pardon?
Could I please ask you to conclude now?
Okay, sorry. Sure. And what we do, we invited women to receive services, and the mothers, and later we include men as well. So at the moment, we are providing services to youth, to mothers, and to husbands and the fathers of the youth, and it's like a holistic service that we are providing services to the whole family. But what we learned is that we could not, we were helping individuals, but it was not a sustainable service, and we were not impacting the societies. To impact Afghan societies, we formed self-help groups, and through self-help groups, we tried to gather women together, and where they could discuss their social problems, which addiction is a main one, and try to find a solution themselves, because when they add their powers together, they can find the decisions and solutions that can help them overcome or decrease these problems within their society and within the area that they are living.
Thank you so much.